So I'm kind of shocked to see how much potential Hydro Traveler had, and how a couple of critical design decisions made everything weird. And don't get me wrong, I love this Hydro version of the Traveler. Like the good boy I am, I obtained both of his constellations, maxed out his gear and talents, just so I can show you in this video what a huge mess he is. But at the same time, how unique he feels, and how much fun I've been having with him. However, here are the top 3 most bizarre things about Hydro Traveler that make him look like a big mistake. And yeah, these things I'll show you do get progressively weirder. Now, the gear I'm using on him is a Jade Cutter with Golden Troop 4 set. This is not the most relatable build, and you can slap on him the new Hunter set instead to boost his critical rate easily, but I just want to show you the damage numbers he can put out with this skill, since this is where the majority of his damage lies. So the first big thing about him that really makes him stand out from the rest of the characters in Genshin is the elemental skill. On paper, the damage is actually pretty good. You can either tap the skill and do some damage to enemies, which does have a little AoE and can pierce them, but the way I've been using him is by holding down the skill and shooting out these little bubbles of water called dewdrops. Like, he can apply Hydro I think about up to 4 times, so you can do some funny vapes with him in a team like International. And again, while the numbers aren't big, they do add up to a decent amount of damage over time. But here's some of the few problems that turn this skill into a laughingstock. First of all, you cannot move around when channeling the skill. Even though the Traveler does gain some decent resistance to interruption, a lot of the times the positioning will lead you to weird outcomes, like a big enemy standing in front of you and soaking up all the damage. And yes, the range is pitiful here. You can barely reach the enemies from standing at this distance, so even if you start a fight, you could literally by accident just not be able to reach them. What's even worse is the hitbox. It's so small that more or less this becomes only viable against single target. Even if you can, for example, switch between enemies while shooting at them and applying Hydro to trigger things like Dendro or Vape reactions consistently. Like, I really wish this skill was more like the ability we obtain from the seals in Underwater. It doesn't even have to be that big of a water ring. Just let the Traveler pierce the enemies, and at least make it so that it can hit 2 or 3 enemies with a single dewdrop. But no. This is what we get instead. I would also like to point out that both of the passives are tied into his skill. The first one creates droplets when he consistently channels a skill. He is the only one who can pick them up right now, and if he does, he can restore up to 28% of his health, since he can create up to 4 of them. At C6, this becomes kind of a heal, because now when he picks up the droplets, they restore 6% HP for a party member with the lowest HP, so in total that would be 24%. The reason why he heals here is that the skill actually slowly siphons his own HP, which is perfect for when using the Hunter set, but the actual amount you heal is pretty much negligible. The other passive is basically there to boost the final hit of the skill when channeling, and you would think that the damage is going to be respectable, but nope, it caps out at 5,000 instead, which is like, why even bother designing a passive like that? All in all, I think the skill is actually really fun to use, especially in world exploration. It's always funny to take out the enemy with the bubbles you're spewing like a Pokemon, but there are so many constraints built into this skill that it makes almost no sense if I decide to go into the Spiral Abyss, because you're not gonna have a good time there. Even if he has a Numa alignment damage he can deal from the skill to disable the new enemies, bringing him into the Abyss is basically a huge damage loss. But I'll talk about his teams later on, and for now, let's take a look at the second thing that bothers a lot of people. I'm not sure what happened when the Hoyo team was designing the burst, but it sure feels like they wanted to troll us. Like, you would think it would be a nice way to apply Hydro when the Traveler is off-field, but no. Not only does it not stop and just powers through everything, but it can even go out of bounds inside the Abyss, which, I'll admit, that's a funny way to troll me. And the thing is, the damage in Hydro application is actually pretty good. I even have the second constellation unlocked, which slows down the burst's movement by 30% and it lasts 3 seconds longer. But in reality, most of the enemies will be hit about 3 or 4 times, and then the burst goes, alright, I'ma head out. As far as I'm aware, when testing this burst, it cannot be stopped like you could with Anemo Travelers or Ayaka's burst. So even in teams like Freeze, it just breezes through everyone. Another huge problem is the cost. Of course it had to be 80, and ironically, most of the teams I've built with him, he is the only Hydro unit. Maybe Nilo Bloom teams that's not the case, but regardless, he can only gain 3 to 4 particles from his skill, and that only triggers when he stops channeling to deliver the big hit or by tapping the skill. So even if his damage was decent at best, you would need a ton of energy recharge to actually use the burst on every rotation. But I mean, sure, since we're already talking about him not being viable in the Abyss, who cares how much energy he needs in world exploration? But then, why not just make it cost lower? It's not like the Hydro application is super reliable anyway. So yeah, to simplify, the burst costs a lot and it doesn't stop moving no matter what, resulting in mediocre Hydro application and damage. So I've been nagging on the Hydro Traveler for a few minutes now. What about the teams that you can build with him? Well, the first one that came to mind was International. I thought, you suckers, you don't realize how good he is in this team. But alas, after raising him, I realized he is a problem child for this team, and not in a good way. So, because the hitbox from the channeled skill shots are super small, and the burst goes into a sunset after a few seconds, the Hydro application is really bad here. So Xiangling's Pyronado doesn't vape that much, and in reverse, you more or less just get to vape the channeled skill damage with the Traveler. I mean, in a single target situation, it's okay, especially if you can double swirl with Kazuha, both Hydro and Pyro, but then, if I wanted to see bigger numbers with Hydro Traveler, instead of Xiangling, I swapped in Mona. On big targets before the bubble pops, it was cool to see the skill hit for big damage, but it's not super realistic in any way, which both applies to the Abyss or just exploring the world. The setup takes time and some precision, so it's more like a fun way to experience it once and forget about it. However, the most ironic thing about Hydro Traveler is that he is actually decent in Dendro teams, just like his Dendro version. Obviously, the Dendro version outclasses Hydro in almost every way, but you do get teams like Hyper Bloom with Raiden, Zhongli, and Nahida, or as I like to call it, Sniper Bloom. You can do awesome things like shooting at each enemy and triggering both Raiden's and Nahida's skill on them from a distance, which results in a cool explosion, while at the same time you have Zhongli's shield to keep yourself protected, but you could do some more shenanigans with other supports. And in Nilo Bloom teams, the same can be done here as well. It actually offers some good precision if you want to trigger the Bloom explosions on enemies who are further away, but don't get me wrong, it's still probably one of the weakest Nilo Bloom versions that you could build by including the Hydro Traveler. I honestly think that there is something redeeming about the skill, and the fact that this is the first channeling ability we get to see in Genshin tells me it won't be the last one, and perhaps it would be interesting to see some new supports or off-field DPS characters who can work in a cohesive way with the Hydro Traveler skill. But the burst? I'm not sure if it's redeemable in any way. Its design is simply too prohibiting from fully utilizing it, and it would need to stay in place either by achieving this with frozen enemies, or if it could collide and be stopped with constructs or bigger enemies. Like, the thing is, because the skill feels like such a novelty at the moment, I actually really enjoy using this new Hydro Traveler, especially since there are so many Hydro puzzles in Fontaine, not to mention all of those Uxia-aligned enemies and objects that can be interacted by using the Numa-aligned skill. I really don't know why Hoyoverse couldn't let the Traveler move when he channels the skill, why it couldn't have longer range or slightly better hitbox, and why of all things the burst could not be stopped in any way, resulting in really mediocre Hydro application and damage. To me, he feels like a mistake, and even if he was a decent Hydro unit, there are so many others in the game that would still outshine him. Hydro is basically the glue of Genshin reactions. Electrocharged, Bloom, Vape reactions all depend on this element, and we already have excellent units like Xingqiu, Yelan, Kokomi, Ayato, who can consistently apply Hydro, so it's not like it would be a huge deal if Hydro Traveler could become a nice Hydro applicator. For now, all I can do with him is just go pew 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 with the skill and have some fun while trying to hold back my Hydro tears. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't take it too seriously. I don't think Hydro Traveler is the worst thing to happen in Genshin, and he is actually fun to use. Although if you're short on resources, then yeah, I wouldn't recommend building him. But regardless, I'm gonna see if I can find a better way to understand how to best utilize this skit, because believe me, I would love to be in the wrong here. But in the meantime, make sure to press that like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.